Matt will dive into David's consumer. Sorry, I'm going to start over. The recording just started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. My name is Mick Mersha. I'm the Director of Content and Engagement at CNP. There's always been a tension for e-commerce retailers between delivering an exceptional user experience and protecting against fraud. By its nature, fraud prevention has traditionally been a source of friction for online users, but the vast majority of an online merchant's customers are legitimate, and they don't like it when their easy online experience is interrupted by fraud checks. So when user experience is the most important thing to a merchant's online customers, how do you make sure they're protected from bad actors without them knowing? To answer that question, we have a great panel with us today. Joining me from NuData Security, a company that validates online users with behavioral and device insights, is Jonathan McRandall, Director of Product Delivery, and Matt Melnick, Director of Analytics and Metrics. Jonathan and Matt will dive into NuData's Consumer and Risk Trends Report that reaffirms an important principle. UX is king, but it's possible to get there securely. Jonathan and Matt, I'll leave it to you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. So as Michael was describing, today we'll talk about managing fraud in a post-pandemic era. And to start with that, we really need to understand what we learned through that pandemic. So throughout the pandemic, we obviously saw large mass online adoption. First-time users were signing up for online services, and previously signed up users were now become more active. They were shopping more, they were banking more, everything that they were doing was online. Historically, we've always known that we've always known that consumers are looking for a seamless experience. They're trying to avoid friction. They're really looking for that really strong, positive user experience that makes them want to continue to shop on that site. And we've seen from surveys that 76% of users are more likely to recommend an application or a brand if the user experience is great. So we saw mass adoption throughout the pandemic. We know that users are looking for a strong user experience, but we also saw fraudsters increase their skill set and become more sophisticated. 47% of the attacks observed by NuData mimicked human behavior. So our standard, very basic fraud detection tools that perhaps rely on velocity or other types of historic trends are no longer effective. We really need to adopt a more sophisticated strategy, and hopefully we'll give you some insight on how you can approach that today. So Matt, maybe I'll pass it over to you and you can talk a little bit more about what we saw.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So the big thing that I wanted to call out early on is just that the growth we've seen in e-com and sort of retail has been huge in the past couple of years. So obviously that started in early 2020, and that was driven because that was really the only way for us to shop at a lot of the time. Many stores were closed, lockdowns, all that going on with the pandemic. We turned to purchasing things online, and everything kept up. It was easier, so that's where we shopped. So we saw a huge growth from 2020 compared to 2019, and interestingly, we saw that growth continue through 2021, and we still see it growing today. So, just comparing all traffic, for e-com, we saw a 24% year-over-year growth, which is pretty impressive comparing 2021 to 2020. And that's as stores reopened. That's as things went back to more of a normal of things that we're used to. So that growth was quite strong. And if we look at just purchases as well, that number is actually even higher. It was 58% year over year increase. So pretty impressive growth there. Even as things reopened and we got back to more normal procedures and how we operate and stuff like that. And you can even see some of that growth on this graph. So the green lines, representing the 2020 traffic there, but you can see that bump up in March and April when our lives kind of got turned upside down there for a little bit, and we had to resort to online shopping. But just looking at this year over year, you can see the orange line of 2021, excuse me, just being consistently higher than 2020 and in all months. So really impressive growth there. And, I'm predicting that we continue to see this type of strong e-com and retail traffic throughout the next year. But let's take a bit of a closer look at the holiday season there, because it's some pretty interesting traffic patterns occurring for both years. So, and I know a lot of retailers and that are used to seeing that sort of green line there, which is 2020 traffic, where Black Friday sales, Cyber Monday, you see a large increase in traffic and sales in November. People are gearing up for the holidays. They're purchasing gifts. They have sales for items that they want to get themselves. Huge increases in traffic. And we saw that in 2021 in 2020, and that was actually even slightly earlier, that peak, than in 2019. So in 2019, we really saw that holiday season, I guess, starting in the first day of November, really early November, whereas in 2020 that had shifted to the middle of October. So it was earlier, but 2021, as you can kind of see in that orange line there, as we're zoomed in now, that increase really started a lot earlier, almost a full month earlier than we saw in 2020. And so there could be a couple reasons to explain that. One being, of course, there's a lot of shipping and logistics delays going on right now. Obviously, we hear the extreme examples of things like automobiles and cars, taking up to a year or longer for delivery. But the same is true of a lot of like consumer goods and electronics. A lot of computer parts are in high demand and they're on back order, and they take a while to ship and all that kind of stuff, right? So consumers are reacting and adapting to that. They know they have to, if they want to have a gift guaranteed to deliver by Christmas, they might need to order in September or October now rather than in November. So it's very interesting how they've adapted and reacted. And you can quite clearly see that shift in traffic into September now. But it highlights the importance of focusing on a good user experience sort of year round now, rather than just, okay, let's sit down in November and make sure everything's all good for this month, and then we're back to quiet times early next year. It's really starting to shape up to be a 365-day sort of watch now, right? So some interesting tidbits there. But what about other industries? What has been going on outside of that? So event ticketing's obviously in 2020 was not that voluminous of an industry, but in 2021, again, as we got more back to normal, shows started coming back, sporting events were back in person, we really saw this industry start to recover. So we saw 126% year over year in just overall traffic growth. Again, a lot of that is because these events started, and as we can kind of see here with the orange line, the attack traffic came back with it. So part of that is because, of course, with no events taking place in 2020, there are really no events for attackers to fraudulently purchase tickets for, sort of take. Sorry, I think Jonathan, do you mind just swapping slides quickly to see if we can get the graphic to show up here? Interesting. Okay. But yeah, so we saw that 126% year over year overall traffic growth, but we also saw 170% in the attack traffic. So these attackers returned as good users returned. So it was an interesting cycle there that kind of showed attackers coming in at the same time as good users. So another reason to kind of focus on good user experience and being able to differentiate those good users from the bad actors. So Jonathan, I'm going to pass it back to you. So chatted a lot about obviously e-commerce purchase fraud, over these past couple slides, but how does the bigger picture look?
Yeah, definitely. And sorry, I'm not sure what happened. There's your graphic.
There it is. Thank you. Yeah.
I was going to say this is a great graphic too, because it shows all of those random spikes as the attackers come in at different times of the year. And then oddly, that dip in September, but like the dip in June and July there goes exactly to what you were saying. Now that you have the graphic, I don't know if there's anything specific you want to point out.
No, I think you just kind of covered it. You can kind of see that cyclical traffic, but you can see the that attack traffic really returning with the good users now that there's events and opportunities for them to make those fraudulent purchases.
Yeah. One of the things that you mentioned kind of with the holiday season is that the focus on user experience has shifted to be year round now. But one of the things that we often hear from the merchants that we work with and from consumers in general is that they're not looking for just a great user experience year round, not just at, say, purchase, but they really want to see that user experience spread across the entirety of the online application. From the moment you log in, maybe instead of using, higher friction usernames and passwords, you can start to use biometrics or something that both offers security and is lower user friction. You talked about a 24% growth in e-commerce traffic, but we also saw a 22% growth in e-commerce attack traffic. So legitimate users are definitely coming in and using online services a lot more, but so are attackers. They've really ramped up some of their attack traffic, and I think that was well reflected in some of your graphs. Fraudsters themselves are also targeting the entire user experience, right? A fraudster's often main goal is to compromise accounts through the login touch point so that they can commit downstream fraud. But meanwhile, consumers want that frictionless user experience across the entire journey. So there's this fine balancing act that we need to strike. Now that we have kind of that overview of what the pandemic brought for us, what can we actually take as learnings from that time period? So you touched on a few key industries a little bit, but really attackers are coming in at higher volume and they're using more sophisticated methods. So the chart that we see on the right here is just displaying what we would classify as a basic type bot attack versus a sophisticated bot or sophisticated fraudster attack, and how that is spread out across different industries over, say, the past year. So when we talk about sophistication and sophisticated attacks, we're talking about fraudsters who come in at lower velocities, human-like velocities, where they're placing one-off transactions and they're not necessarily coming in and targeting a card screen where they'll cycle through stolen credit cards at mass volumes. They'll do it low, they'll do it slow. Fraudsters will put in the extra effort to spoof their devices, trying to avoid device identification technology, trying to avoid fraud rules that are looking for trends within device parameters. Fraudsters are going to great lengths to emulate their devices and spoof the devices. Similarly, they're doing the same with human behavior, or with behaviors with the keyboard and with the mouse. In traditional bot or automated attacks, you don't see any form of human behavior, and you see it take place at high velocity. Now, we already know that they're coming in at lower velocity with more sophisticated attacks. They're spoofing their devices, and they're also spoofing human behaviors. So the things like the keystrokes, the mouse movements, and even touch events if they're emulating a mobile device. And finally, the last big characteristic of a sophisticated attack is its ability to overcome friction. So reCAPTCHA has always been a popular tool for dealing with automation, with the idea being that it's low friction for a human to solve, but for a bot to solve it has traditionally been quite difficult. We've seen that change drastically over the past 2 years. The use of human CAPTCHA solving farms have become much more popular, and really the spread of machine learning and artificial intelligence, we've seen that take a big hit on the efficacy of CAPTCHA rates as well. Matt, perhaps you have a few other examples you want to share?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what have we seen while tackling these attacks that are looking more human, right? We've seen 33%, so over a third of these attacks use sort of non-scripted techniques to, automate their cycling, whether that be credit card numbers or filling out forms, login, whatever it might be. But they're appearing human and they're attempting to avoid detection, really. And you touched on a lot of the ways they do that. Having mouse click events, having touch events if it's a mobile device, spending a reasonable amount of time on a page. That kind of goes with that low and slow theory that you were mentioning, that rather than just sending a super high velocity attack that spends milliseconds on a page, they're dwelling longer, and it looks more legitimate with their inputs, right? It's becoming harder to differentiate a good user from these bots. Also saw a pretty interesting increase in clean IPs being used. So 40% of the attacks used clean IPs, absolutely no negative history on that IP. That's not always been the case, especially during those sort of high velocity events. They were sort of cycling kind of reused IPs that had just been used constantly from higher risk countries that we see all the time, and that was that. But a lot of IP obfuscation now, and they're looking to set up in the country that the merchant's located in. So that the user base again blends in with this attack, and they have access to IPs that just don't have a bad history associated with them. So just kind of looking at IP is not very efficient these days. And then looking at like the NuData trust network, we were able to pick up 60% of these sophisticated attacks were flagged by high risk data anchors that exist in our consortium. So they're cycling some things, but they're not really thinking about the bigger picture. So kind of interesting that we can still be able to pick up some tells, but they are getting smarter, and they're evolving beyond just reusing the same IP day after day kind of thing. So so Jonathan, I'll pass it back to you and just kind of say, what do we do next now that we know all this?
And sorry, very quickly before we jump through that, you were telling me earlier that it's not just clean IPs, but now they're IPs that are coming from legitimate ISPs.
That's right. That's right. We've seen a lot of IPs recently using T-Mobile, using AT&T in the States. And that's very new, and that obviously adds a next layer of complexity to these and sophistication to these kind of attacks. They're using IPs that just about anybody, any good user that you expect to come into your environment has. So a very interesting shift there from those, again, as I mentioned, higher risk countries across the world. Their IPs, you see them thousands of times, and they're all high risk events, easy to spot kind of thing. But we've seen a big shift into much more reputable IP ISPs and carriers for sure.
Which, as you mentioned, begs the question of what is it that we do next? So we know that fraud is getting more sophisticated. They're spoofing devices. They're using legitimate ISPs and clean IPs. So what are people doing? So across the industry, I think people have focused or started to really focus on three key attributes. So they're starting to look a lot more at behavior, for instance. I mentioned earlier that fraudsters are going to great lengths to spoof human behavior, actually spoof keystrokes, spoof mouse movements and touch events, which obviously makes it difficult for us to detect some of that fraud that's taking place. I think the big trend that we've seen from especially the merchant community is the shift towards leveraging more granular behavioral insights and using it not just for fraud detection, but also to improve that user experience. So for example, if you are able to use some of that behavioral insights to create one-to-one profiles for individual consumers or individual accounts. You can give that account a more frictionless experience when the behaviors are in line with the historical activity for that account, but you can also use it for fraud detection. So the simplest example here is, let's say that we're analyzing the speed at which a user typically types, maybe types in the billing address or the shipping address during a checkout flow. If we know that our user typically types at, say, 50 words per minute, and they very rarely make any mistakes as they're typing, so limited use of the backspace key, then we can perhaps skip over the CVV check or the zip code check to really improve that user experience in that slightest way. If, however, we see a user come in and they complete a checkout process, and now they're typing at 40 words per minute, so they're typing a little bit slower, and they're making more mistakes, they're using the backspace key a lot more, this has started to elevate the risk a little bit. It seems as though something has changed within the profile. We don't necessarily need to know what it is, but maybe now is a good time to introduce a little bit of friction. So that's generally what I mean when I talk about behavior. And there's a renewed focus, I would say, on device intelligence. So yes, fraudsters are going to great lengths to spoof their device, but we can still leverage device intelligence in a similar fashion, recognizing returning users and then introducing friction or additional fraud mitigation when we're unable to recognize the consumer based on their device. So having a strong device identifier that's bound to the device and is repeatable such that you see it every time that the consumer interacts with you, that's a big step. Reducing friction, again, removing CVV or the zip code when you recognize the consumer coming from a trusted device, and then introducing friction when it's a new device acting on the account. And then finally, the concept of a trust network. So Matt, you called out kind of the NuData trust network, but really anything where you're able to leverage a large pool of data from ideally outside just your organization. So, we talked about IPs and how they're clean and they aren't necessarily being reflected on block lists these days. But if you can look at the historical reputation of an IP across, say, other merchants within your industry, you can start to understand whether that IP has historically been associated with high risk or whether it has placed a lot of transactions at other merchants and has never resulted in, say, a chargeback. Potentially, you can also look at some PII data elements. So if you're gathering something like a shipping address and an email address and the IP address, then you can do an association lookup to see if those three entities have been tied together, both within your organization, but most effective if you have a data lake of sorts of data from other merchants and other players within the industry. Now, good users themselves, they have a lot of things in common, right? So what I mean by this is, as I interact with a merchant online, as I'm going through my shopping, online shopping, I'm doing so in very predictable ways. And it kind of goes back to that concept of building out user profiles, looking at how fast I type, looking at whether I use a mouse or a touch screen, looking at specific attributes of my typing behavior. So again, I mentioned typing speed earlier, but also how likely am I to make mistakes? Am I capitalizing letters as I type in, say, my name? My last name has 2 capitals. I'm very picky about that, but a fraudster probably isn't going to take note of that detail, and they'll type a lowercase g instead of an uppercase G. And I personally always use the same laptop for all of my online shopping. I personally don't do a lot of shopping from my phone, but that's a great signal for a merchant to leverage, as they know that I'm always shopping from the same device. And Matt, I think you've got a few really great examples of how you can leverage this to both improve the user experience and identify fraud.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think everything you've kind of just mentioned in the past few minutes are really just like layers here, right? And we're talking about putting all these layers of data together to make the most informed decision we can each time. So you really want to build build out a good history for each of your good users, and know all those layers. What is their normal device? What is their normal typing cadence, and all that, right? So let's look at this example specifically where we have a good user that lives in Memphis, and they normally log in from there. We can, for example, let's say they're using their mobile phone, and we look at their login in late April. It's fine. We look at their login in early May. It's fine. But then in comes a login from Los Angeles, sort of early to mid-May there, a few days after they've logged in from Memphis. If we're just talking one data element, the location's changed. But do you really want to friction a good user just because one item has changed? If we dug into that Los Angeles example, we would see that the device remained the same, the behavioral patterns remained all the same. The location, of course, changed, but everything else was fine. The device was there. The all the items you mentioned, Jonathan, the typing patterns, the time on the page, all that behavioral information was similar to what this account's profile has. So you can make that recommendation that says, hey, even though this is the first time we've seen them from Los Angeles, maybe they're just on vacation, maybe they're on business travel. We can allow that to proceed without friction. And then the interesting part of this example is this person ends up returning to Memphis. They log in. They have no friction. They're at their house in Memphis. They're using their phone. It's all good. Later that day, they had 2 rapid logins from Salt Lake City. So a decent number of hours apart. There's it's possible that somebody could have hopped on a plane in Memphis and been in Salt Lake City 8 hours later. It's definitely possible. But when you see these data layers kind of change, so we saw the device change, we saw the location change, obviously, again, we saw that behavioral input change. We saw different typing patterns, like you mentioned, Jonathan, with the way you type your last name would probably be a lot different than the way somebody trying to impersonate you would type it, right? How you type your address, how you interact with the form. I'm reading off a spreadsheet. I stole your information. I got to hit backspace a couple more times than normal. All that information kind of adds up and lets you make that decision that says, okay, this login is definitely weird. We want to step this up and we want to friction this. So the same is true at purchase, Jonathan. If we move on to the next slide, you can also pick these kind of tells up. So a lot of the same principles that we've just talked about really apply here at purchase. This user in this example, it's normally in Jacksonville, North Carolina, but we see there right in the middle, a random new device attempts to make a purchase in Illinois one day. Again, that is a reasonable travel possibility, especially considering these are multiple days apart. But when you look at the big picture and you put all this information together, and really you know the history of this account and what they normally buy and when they buy and where they are when they buy. When all that changes, that's when you can step up. You can block the purchase. You can sandbox it. Whatever it is you want to do, that exists. And the beauty of building the reason I like this example is the beauty of building out this account history and really understanding, allowing this user to have a good user experience is when they come back. You can see them come back at their presumably house or office in North Carolina there. They can proceed without friction again. Their account isn't locked. It's not, and they don't need to refill in all their information. Obviously, security principles apply there, but they're not really having a terrible user experience because somebody attempted to make a fraudulent purchase with their account. And that really building out that sort of good user behavior and account ownership history is very important to doing that. So two kind of interesting examples there about ways to use it at different touch points too. As we've kind of talked about, the full user experience extends beyond purchase, right? There are logins, there's password resets, there's account creations. Having that good experience and protecting, of course, all those touch points is very important. So just wanted to move on to sort of some high level stats about, the benefits of using this approach now that I've given some sort of in-depth examples there as to some fraudulent patterns. One of our FI clients recognized 91% of their user base as returning users, which, immediately, if you can take 91% of your user base and say, hey, we're confident enough that you don't need friction from this, request, that's a great step in the right direction. And it allows you to keep a very low false positive rate as well. Once you really get comfortable with that history and see that, growth and account ownership and stuff like that, you can keep that very low false positive rate while maintaining an extremely high, mitigation rate on these fraudulent attempts. So I definitely think there's a huge benefit to looking at this, again, from a fraud protection standpoint and from a good known user experience standpoint. So Jonathan, I'll throw it back to you to kind of finish up here and say, knowing these statistics and these examples, what is it that you recommend for 2022 and beyond, really?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of called it out in the layered approach, right? So layered approach using multiple different types of technologies, using behavior, using device, using something like a trust network from a larger data pool, but also applying your fraud strategy across the entire user experience. And I'm just going to put you on the hot seat here and throw you one more question about kind of these results. Was there anything specific about the strategy that was used for this type of use case that was particularly effective? Like, was behavior one of the more effective things? Was device one of the more effective things? Was it the fact that we were integrated across multiple different touch points? Or was it just the whole layered approach?
I really think it was the layered approach. So, and you kind of named all three there, like looking at the behavior, it is very important to be able to pick that kind of information up and really helps build that profile just beyond device and IP. I kind of mentioned earlier that they're using cleaner IPs, and you brought up that they're using, very good, reputable US ISPs and carriers, right? So if you just want to look at IP, it's not going to be very effective at the end of the day. So layering all that stuff together is very important and really sort of sets this strategy apart, in my opinion.
Got it. Yeah. So, I mean, moving beyond the pandemic and hopefully into a completely post-pandemic world, we know that consumers are looking for a fantastic user experience. User experience is truly king. That's how you maintain retention. That's how you drive through high checkout rates and minimize cart abandonments. We know that fraudsters are becoming more sophisticated. They're starting to act a little more human-like. Whether they're still using automation and whether they're just increasing that automation versus the fraudster actually committing all of the fraud themselves, I think automation is always going to play a role, because that's how fraudsters ultimately hit their return on their investment. But that automation is becoming harder to detect because they are spoofing devices and spoofing human behavior. But despite that, I think the use of behavioral tools and really building out user profiles for individual consumers is going to be key. We've seen it work very effectively for a lot of the merchants and other institutions that we work with today. So it's definitely becoming more popular, and it's harder to spoof, right? If I'm a fraudster, it's difficult for me to understand how fast Matt types and emulate some of his behavior. It's easy for me to emulate human behavior, humans type, but how fast does Matt actually type? So I think leveraging some of those behavioral tools is going to be a big component of fraud strategies moving forward. And with that, I think we were only slotted for a half hour, so it's possible we ran over here, but definitely open
This
to
is really great, Jonathan and Matt. Thank you so much. I meant to mention this at the front, that we will be taking questions at the end, and then we've reached that portion. I really, the fact that these really easy actions, I mean, this low-hanging fruit merchants can can easily take to improve their customers' overall user experience. I mean, that's invaluable information. But we want to open up to questions from the audience now. Please feel free to use the Q&A tab or the chat feature to submit your questions. I have received a couple DMs already, so let's start with those. The first one is, how can you differentiate between users in the same account?
Matt, perhaps you want to take that, because I think that ties in well with the examples that you're showing towards the end there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the interesting strategy to this approach is that you can build multiple profiles within an account, because obviously there are some instances where husband and wife or family members do share the same account, and it's completely normal, and they're both rightful owners of the payment method, and they're completing true purchases. There's no chargeback risk. So that's the beauty. And a lot of times those a lot of the data anchors do stay constant through that. So a lot of times the device might stay the same. It might be a home computer or a shared laptop. The geolocation would likely be very similar between the two. And like I said, you can with this strategy, you can build out multiple behavioral profiles as long as there's that sort of history of good behavior. Then there's no limit to training multiple profiles to an account or to a user at the end of the day, right?
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Speaking of behavioral tools, are they useful for checkout when the only action is a purchase being made?
I can jump onto that one. So even within your checkout experience, there's still behaviors that are taking place. I can think of one large online retailer that ships goods to my house in a single day. They have a very frictionless user experience, but I still go in there and I still double check the billing address that I want, double check the shipping address that I want, because sometimes I send things to the office, sometimes I send things home. And really, I spend probably a pretty predefined amount of time on that page. Now, if you think about a fraudster, if they're able to compromise my account with this merchant, they're going to go in and they're probably going to change the shipping address, and they're probably going to spend either a much longer time on page as they review some of their details, or a very, very short amount of time on that page because they just want to get the checkout through. So I think there's still definitely benefits to using behavioral tools, even if you have a perfectly streamlined checkout process, which, truthfully, a lot of us can improve on.
Right on. That makes sense. I got another direct message here. What are some easy wins for a fraud strategy that is dealing with a reduced budget that can help us focus on and improve user experience for our customers? I suppose that goes along to a lot of different merchants. What do you think?
I've got at least one idea, Matt. I don't know if you want to take a first stab at it.
No, go ahead, Jonathan.
Okay, I'm going to run with it. So easy win. I think perhaps what I've heard from other merchant fraud teams in the past is that they don't necessarily have a huge fraud budget as much as some other teams might. So this is kind of where we come into that. How can we improve the user experience while also mitigating that fraud? And I think it's helpful to think about other teams within the organization that are focused on improving the user experience. So by that, I mean, if you have a team that is focused on reducing checkout abandonments, they're probably doing so by analyzing metrics on the checkout page to understand where users are actually abandoning the flow. If you're able to work with that team and incorporate some of those metrics, some of those statistics that you're gathering as the user checks out, you might be able to leverage those existing stats within your fraud strategy. So it's another team that's responsible for building them out. It's another team that's kind of responsible for managing it, but you might be able to find some fraud insights when your fraud focused team actually takes a look at it. So overall, I'd say talk with other people, talk with other teams within your organization, see what might be of interest to you, and see if you're able to leverage that within your fraud strategy.
That makes total sense, and we talk about staying out of silos a lot and integrating, you know, fraud fraud teams with other teams. You know, that's a pretty consistent thing. But moving on, how do we specifically integrate behavioral tools, and how long does it take?
I so prior prior to my current role at NuData, I've worked on our customer delivery team, so I can tackle that one. So again, talk with other teams within your organization, because it's possible that they're already gathering some level of behavior insights to, say, reduce checkout abandonments, and then you're partially already integrated. You can start to leverage that. But if you want to really get serious about behavior, I would kind of suggest looking at vendors, simply because that is all that they do. They've built out machine learning models to handle that, and they know the behavioral attributes that are most effective. Speaking from kind of my experience, you know, integrating with a vendor can take anywhere from a couple weeks to a couple months, largely kind of dependent on your organization's process. If you are insistent on doing it in-house, just keep in mind that it's going to be most effective if you feed it into a machine learning model. So you're going to need to have training data, and you're going to need to have some patience while that model gets up to speed.
That makes sense. We got time for one or two more. And if we don't get to any of your questions, you know, obviously either Jonathan or Matt will be in touch with you after the fact. I do have one for saying our current fraud strategy is maintained in an orchestration platform. Can I still leverage these types of behavioral tools? And if so, how?
I think the question that you perhaps need to ask is, who owns the checkout flow and the resources associated with that? So I know a lot of organizations that use orchestration platforms, but they still own the user experience, and then they send the data to the orchestration platform for fraud decisioning. So when we talk about behavior, obviously you need to deploy resources against the user experience to gather some of those metrics. But then if you are using an orchestration platform, you can still send that behavioral data into that platform to actually decision on. So there may be two components at play there, both the user experience side of things and your orchestration platform side of things. But there's definitely ways to incorporate behavioral tools with each of them.
Thank you very much, Jonathan and Matt. Thanks for your time and your expertise, and you know, really helping our merchants, you know, find that low-hanging fruit of how to increase, you know, the basically reduce friction for good users and selectively increase the friction where needed. Really appreciate your time and efforts. And you know, as I said, we did record this webinar, so the rebroadcast will be available to everyone in about a week or so. We just have to get that all squared away. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you the next time.
Thanks all.
Thank you, everyone.